It is tempting to compare Brazilian novelist Clarice Lispector to Virginia Woolf, and it's usually the first name you see alongside hers in any article or biography that you read. And it's not an unfair comparison. Both are magnificent writers whose writing focuses much more on the interior worlds of their characters than it does on their external lives. The reason I think it's not necessarily a good comparison though is because I think it sets the wrong expectations. Lispector writes like she is reinventing the idea of the novel, and there really is no writer quite like her. She's a writer that, although loved in her native land, doesn't yet get her due credit on the international stage. So today on Out of the Page, I would like to try and correct that just a little bit and tell you the story of one of Brazil's greatest novelists, Clarice Lispector, a prodigy and a star. Clarice was born Clarice Lispector in a Jewish shtetl in western Ukraine in 1920, right in the middle of the Russian Civil War. During her infancy, her family suffered greatly during the anti-Semitic pogroms that plagued much of the Russian Empire. And when they were finally able to flee, they made their way across the globe to Brazil. They settled in Recife, where they struggled financially and where Clarice's mother died when she was 9 years old. When she was 15, her father moved them all to the metropolis of Rio de Janeiro, where he also died while she was aged 20 years old, the same year that her first short story was published. Clarice had decided as a teenager to pursue literature, but still entered the University of Brazil's prestigious law school for her tertiary studies. To support herself, she worked as a journalist, and in 1942, she began work on her first novel. To concentrate, she famously moved from the apartment she shared with her siblings and into a boarding house where she worked intensely on the novel for a month. Her friends who read the draft recalled being stunned by the quality of the writing and were convinced immediately that it was a book of significance. When it was published a year later, the critics agreed and heralded Clarice as the new voice of Brazilian literature. She was 23 years old. The novel Near to the Wild Heart is a great entry point to her writing as well. The plot revolves around the life and loves of a Brazilian woman from her prodigious childhood through to an unhappy marriage, and focuses, as does the majority of her writing, on her emotional states and the streams of her consciousness. Hence the comparisons to Virginia Woolf. The writing is her own though, and although it certainly is a novel, it reads very much more like a prose poem. It's also very short, clocking in at just over 200 words, which is a pattern we see in most of her writing as well. In the same year, she married her first husband, who was a diplomat for the Brazilian Foreign Service, and they moved to Belém in the north of the country, before moving on to Europe, where they lived for periods in Italy, Switzerland, England, and then finally to the US. At this time, Clarice was expected to fulfill the role of a diplomat's wife, hosting dinners and living a conventional life, all of which made her miserable. She stated, "I hated it, but I did what I had to do. I gave dinner parties, I did everything you're supposed to do, but with a disgust." She notably hated Switzerland and loved England, but the sum of her time abroad was 2 novels, 2 sons, a struggling marriage, and a longing for home. In 1959, the marriage finally dissolved and Clarice returned to Brazil with her children. And in case it isn't already obvious, none of this really sounds like the typical life of a great writer. As much as she was admired by the industry, she kept herself purposefully apart from it. She didn't teach, she didn't lecture, she rarely gave interviews, and she kept the publishing world at arm's length, all of which gave her somewhat of a mythical quality and even gave rise to genuine questions as to whether or not Clarice Lispector, the person, existed at all. Back in Brazil, despite her already established reputation as a critically acclaimed novelist, she struggled financially from the moment they arrived. It was difficult to find a publisher for her first short story collection, Family Ties, which she had written whilst living in the US, and it finally emerged in 1960. This was again released to an extraordinary reception, but it was her novel The Passion According to G.H., released in 1964, which finally and truly secured her place atop Brazilian literature. The Passion is a story about a rich woman who has a spiritual awakening whilst cleaning the room of her maid who has just quit. It is written, like much of the work that followed it, in Lispector's signature interior monologue style, with a heavy focus on philosophy and identity. It also features the most famous cockroach in literature since Kafka's Metamorphosis. In 1966, an event would take place that would shape the last decade of her life. Clarice fell asleep with a lit cigarette in her hand and awoke to her apartment in flames. In an attempt to save her unfinished writing, she tried to put out the fire with her bare hands and suffered extensive burns to her arms and legs. She spent the next 3 months in hospital in constant pain and almost needed to have her right hand amputated. To be expected, the accident was traumatizing to her and she felt its pain for the rest of her life. It also led to a dramatic change in her writing practice. She required help with her day-to-day living and ended up meeting and hiring an assistant, Olga Borelli, a former nun and admirer of Lispector's writing. She feared she would never write the same again, and instead of her usual frenetic pace, her novels and stories began now as scraps and fragments. She'd never allowed any editing to her writing before, but with Olga now a part of her everyday life, they together would trim and edit the fragments into complete works. In this way, in 1973, she published Agua Viva, and in 1977, The Hour of the Star. She already had a fearsome reputation, but somehow these 2 books managed to only increase it and are regularly regarded as her masterpieces. The Hour of the Star is the more famous and tells the story of a poor and starving young woman living in the slums of Rio. Only a few days after it was published, Clarice was admitted to hospital where she was diagnosed with inoperable cancer and died only 3 months later. She was 56 years old. Olga edited together a final novel, A Breath of Life, released in 1978. And with that, Lispector's legacy was complete. However, it wouldn't be until roughly 30 years later, when a biography was published in English by Benjamin Moser, that the non-Portuguese speaking world really started to embrace her as a figure of world literature. Her work started to appear in new translations from the mid-2010s, and her name is finally finding its place among the likes of Kafka and Joyce as one of the major stylists of the 20th century. I said at the start that comparing Lispector to Virginia Woolf seemed unfair to me, but there is a writer who I think she does bear some comparison to, and that is the American novelist Carson McCullers. And not because of their writing style, because they are quite different, but because of the lives they led. Both were prodigious writers who wrote masterpieces in the early 20s. Both lived difficult and often tragic lives, and both are experiencing somewhat of a reappraisal as of late. This video was written as a companion piece to a video about McCullers, which should be out in good time, so please keep an eye out for it. And the way you can do that is by subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and giving the video a like so it will appear in your recommendations. Thank you for watching. If you haven't checked out Lispector's writing, as I say with every single video, give it a go. It is difficult. I will warn anyone who's come in unfamiliar with her writing already. She's not an easy writer. I compared her to Joyce and Kafka because I think she bears comparison in the scale of difficulty alongside them, and that's quite a big spectrum. But she is a worthwhile writer and her writing is rewarding. And so until then, stay safe, stay sane, and I'll see you later.